Caleb, welcome to Muster. Um, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how you discovered Edward McCabe and kind of how you found the origins of this book.
Sure, and thank you so much for having me. I first heard of Edward McCabe on a random trip during undergrad from the University of Oklahoma, where I went to undergrad, to Langston. I was a member of a fraternity, Alpha Alpha, and we had kind of our convening there at Langston. And when you're in Langston, you realize there are no hotels, so you stay in Guthrie, which is the former capital of the territory of Oklahoma. And on one of their main streets, their main thoroughfares, there's a small green plaque that says Edward P. McCabe in front of where his office once was, where he was the treasurer. And what I noticed even in that moment was that I just kind of assumed he couldn't have actually existed because what was being espoused by this guy seemed so far-fetched, so beyond what I could imagine. He was espousing this notion of all black towns and an all black state. And despite the fact that I grew up in Oklahoma, I didn't hear about him in my textbooks. So it's actually while working on my first book where I would kind of see these correspondences between Black people who were citizens of various indigenous nations, like the Creek Nation in particular, writing these letters about how expansive their experiences of citizenship had been in both the Oklahoma Indian territories and why it was of significant importance for Black people to turn their attention there. Um, and it was in a contrast, it was in stark relief and contrast to the kind of experiences of the Black people McCabe had been leading in Kansas. And so it became clear to me that there was more to do there, and more fodder to mine for. And then I ended up realizing just how interesting he was, how narcissistic and braggadocious and polarizing of a figure he was then. And I thought for sure that that is the sort of Virgil you want for a story, one who isn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but one who is incredibly ostentatious and a bit full of himself. And that makes for a much more intriguing read for a popular audience, but then at the same time, for a more scholarly audience, it gives us the opportunity to view a particular moment of history, hopefully from a very different vantage point.
Right. I want to get to the kind of his specific moment and write this kind of moment that kind of anticipates and kind of sees the a fading of Reconstruction, but the kind of continuance of Black politics in a number of places across the country, especially in the West. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about colonization, right? And there's a number of ways that that shows up, right? There's the classic understanding of colonization, right? This kind of idea around Liberia, the American Colonization Society, but then you also have a very kind of post-bellum, post-Civil War kind of wrestling with colonization. So I wonder if you could say a little bit here about how you think through colonization in the book.
Sure. So what's interesting about McCabe is that he calls this effort, right, that we kind of put in the subtitle, right, this fight for a black state, a Negro colonization scheme, right, or an Oklahoma colonization scheme for the Negro, is how you see it portrayed oftentimes, both through his words, through his comrades' words, and also through some of his antagonists' words, right? And that presented to me something interesting because in my enfeebled 21st century brain, colonization, in many cases, we assume means kind of one thing. But what we see in the case of this book is that there were a number of colonization schemes of varying types. So we, of course, as you mentioned, the American Colonization Society, trying to identify perhaps is Liberia potentially a potential solution for the quote unquote Negro problem. We see in the book some harrowing examples of trying to settle or resettle a portion of an island off the coast of Haiti known as Little Cow Island. We also see the effort to migrate west, even before, as you mentioned, the post-bellum, pre-bellum, the before the Civil War, among a lot of immigrant aid societies collectively organized under the New England Immigrant Aid Company that was attempting to try and make Kansas's admission to the Union, a free one, in which slavery would not be permitted to extend itself. So there are a bunch of activities and movements of free peoples trying to figure out what exactly do we do. In many cases, I try and pinpoint McCabe's innovation as one of using, if we're going to borrow from Audre Lorde, using the master's tools to essentially position himself and the people that he would lead as the colonizers, right? The ones who would forge and craft their own promised land. So instead of, and all the other examples that I pointed out, those were primarily efforts pioneered by white people to settle the quote unquote Negro problem, oftentimes expelling them from the United States. But for McCabe's part, he thought, well, why not do that here within the United States? And why don't you give me kind of the keys to the proverbial kingdom? And again, problematic as that is, because it was, right? There were thousands and thousands of citizens of various indigenous nations who had been forcibly removed to that part of the country that he would be essentially building this new black life, this new black promised land atop of. But it seemed to me as both a matter of scholarly intervention, but also as a way of helping the reader kind of see an imperfect set of people trying to craft this perfect land for themselves as a way of usefully getting the reader into this time period in which, again, as you mentioned, uh, there were myriad colonization schemes pioneered, McCabe's being one, but one that he himself is saying, this is something that we think as Black people we can do for ourselves. In fact, when he posits this opportunity to Benjamin Harrison, he's essentially stating, let us give you the chance to show us that we know what we're doing, that we can, in fact, govern ourselves. And his pitch to Black people, especially from the American South, was to come away from the lawless lynchers of the South unmolested by white society. I mean, these are his words, not mine. And so, as such, the colonization effort is unique, if anything else.
Right. Though there's something both particular and something kind of almost quotidian that kind of this era was an era of questing, of kind of town building, of kind of, I mean, searching for kind of place building. And I think along those lines, right, one of the kind of major themes in Reconstruction history, but also American history more broadly, is this kind of search for Black geographies.
Mhm.
Sometimes this is deeply entwined with a project of Black nationalism, and you
Mhm.
have kind of major kind of proto-Black nationalist figures at this moment. The historian Stephen Hahn talks about, right, the kind of mid 19th century up to the early 20th century as this kind of nation building, nation under our feet moment. You're talking about the formation of a Black state. You talk about McCabe's use of this language of Negro supremacy, right? The kind of old slur that's sometimes used to kind of denigrate Reconstruction, right? The kind of Du Bois flipping that kind of Black Reconstruction term and thinking about this as a moment of deep social democracy. I'm wondering kind of how you think about, right, McCabe's Black nationalism, but also this kind of specific moment where kind of there's a quest for a Black nation.
During the writing of this book, I was perplexed, because, as you mentioned in your question, there seem to be so many perspectives being advanced as to what it was that McCabe was doing and how to appropriately like categorize that, or what taxonomy would I use to distinguish it from these other myriad attempts, efforts, both during that time, before and after it, and contemplating people like Steve Hahn and others who presented different examples, or even people like William Lewis, who was examining, well, what could this be like on the Mexican border? I mean, there's just so many. And the thing that helped me in my searching was revisiting Tommy Shelby's We Who Are Dark. And for those of you who are not familiar, Tommy Shelby is a phenomenal philosopher who's at Harvard. He wrote this phenomenal book called We Who Are Dark, where he is both utilizing Martin Delany as a bit of a cipher through which to then examine these almost evolutionary cycles that he sees, or transformations of Black nationalism, or types and typologies of Black nationalism. And he advances, and I'm going to paraphrase because we don't have time to go into that illustrious book, which I love. It's one of my favorites of all time. Um, and made me want to abandon my book and write a new Martin Delany biography. But that's another conversation for the day. What he kind of posits is that there are multiple forms of Black nationalism, right? And that one of those forms that I think aligned much more with what I saw McCabe doing was this more pragmatic version of Black nationalism, whereby, yes, by creating a constituency that's consolidated and apart, we can still have not so much a seat at the table in the most kind of colloquial sense, but there are bases of power that then allow these sorts of Black leaders like McCabe to then influence the shaping of policy so as to not ignore this particular group. So instead, as opposed to creating this separate Black geography that operates in complete distance and contrast from this broader white society, that in fact there's a way in which this brass knuckled politicking can be used as a way of advancing these Black national interests and efforts. And so what I saw in McCabe, especially in his advancement of the cause of this Black state, even the attempt to make Oklahoma a Black state, the Oklahoma Territory a Black state, is a representative example of this, right? Like the it wasn't necessarily a bunch of lofty goals and perspectives, right? The reason people were using Negro supremacy as an epithet was in part to intimidate and scare non-Black residents of the Oklahoma Territory and the surrounding areas so as to ensure that Black people didn't accumulate the numbers. It was a numbers game, right? If they could get, in McCabe's mind, enough Black people to migrate both from the North and the South into Oklahoma Territory, well, then the case would be made for itself, right? It wasn't, it wasn't a debate of purely lofty goals, perspectives, and philosophical frameworks. Those flow down into the daily lives of trying to recruit enough Black people such that the case was made for them that this, in fact, could be a Black state, that there would be no question as to whether or not they could be a Black state. So for me, I fondly remember in 2021 and 2022 being lost and stuck and unable to kind of complete the manuscript because I hadn't revisited Tommy Shelby's phenomenal work, We Were Dark, in which I could kind of see the multiplicity of ways in which Black nationalism could be expressed, especially when I saw McCare, I didn't know how to appropriately categorize him because he was relatively unmoored by the particulars, as you mentioned earlier, of these sorts of political positions and philosophical frameworks. He essentially was just doing the thing that he thought, in my reading of the history, the thing that he thought could tactily work, right? That could actually result in a winning of the numbers game. And so in that way, I found him to be this very pragmatic Black nationalist that was really unfussed by it. So to really quickly put a pin on this, you mentioned how earlier that some people would use Negro supremacy as an epithet. What we see McCabe do is almost saying, sure, why not? Yes, Negro supremacy. Why, I'll take that one as well. Yes, if that means that we will have a Black senator, we'll have Black congressmen, we'll have Black governors, we'll have Black municipal leaders and teachers and so on and so forth, then yes, sure, that will in fact be Negro supremacy, if that's what you want to call it. It seemed as if he was relatively unbothered by these categorizations, and that these categorizations would be the sort of things that I and you and others would discuss far after he was gone.
Right, right. No, it's a as a figure who's deeply involved in Republican Party politics, someone who is kind of a man of the era, right? This is someone who is thinking in, like as you said, a pragmatic way, very similar to his generation of kind of leaders and the kind of understanding that um, things in the South are changing, but that doesn't mean that the broader project of
Mm.
black political worlds, black placemaking is necessarily over. Um, I want to get you out on this question about thinking about the West in this moment, right? Kind of the West in Reconstruction, right? Kind of one of the big shifts in the historiography is thinking about moving beyond a North-South story with the Reconstruction era. Elliot West kind of coining this phrase, the greater reconstruction. And I know your first work, We Refuse to Forget, is deeply involved and engaged with the West. Conversation with scholars like Elena Roberts, among others, Megan Kate Nelson, who are thinking about kind of the ways that this is a story of not only the kind of remaking of the American South, but remaking of a broader continental nation. And one of the really interesting things about your book is, right, you're thinking about multiple West, right? Kind of
Mhm.
this project begins in Kansas, right? And kind of you're thinking about the Exoduster movement, Ku Kluxer, Kansas, as you name one of these chapters. So, right, you have the first stage of this kind of post-Reconstruction migration, but you're also thinking through Oklahoma and the relationship of Oklahoma going from Washington, D.C. to Oklahoma, thinking about territorial status and statehood status. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you think about um, the West broadly in this project, but also the maybe the Black West, and right how might we think
Mhm.
about returning to and thinking about African American history in the late 19th century through Edward McCabe and his ambitions, but also, okay, what do we have to kind of gain by kind of returning to and thinking through places like Nicodemus, Langston, and ultimately places like Tulsa?
Sure, that's a really weighty question. So I'm going to try and do my best to answer it as well as I can. So I think that I, I'll start from a very personal perspective. I always felt so my family is Jamaican. We My family migrated to New York where I was born, and then when I was young, we decided to move to Tulsa for reasons that I have no good explanations for that. And just to kind of get ahead of that question, so I always felt as if, at least as a child and as a teenager, that I was somehow kind of left out of the a broader popular conversation about what it meant to belong in America and what it meant that what it meant for my and my future children's or my and my the folks that I grew up around, what it meant to be kind of part of an American story. Because as you mentioned, it felt, at least the way we were educated as kids and as young adults, it felt as if, like, if you weren't really part of this kind of North-South divide conversation, or if you weren't a part of the Texas story or the California story, that you kind of existed in this nowhere land. And It didn't feel as if, I mean, it wasn't until reading other scholars as I got older, right? Even Taya Miles is like very, very early work, right? That I felt as if the place that I grew up played some role in the broader American story, as diverse, as complex, as contradictory as those many stories are. It felt as if ours didn't really have much to say. So I think from a personal perspective, maybe I had an axe to grind. Maybe that was like the most non-journalistic thing of me to do, was to bring that personal axe to grind, even if it didn't show up on the pages explicitly. So from there, it felt to me that it was of particular importance that we realize that, yes, Kansas, in my mind, in my reading of the history, was effectively a proxy battle in advance of what we would then fight later on, right? The story of Bleeding Kansas, yes, provided an opportunity for us to then examine what was to come, right? It served almost as a harbinger, but then even more so explicitly as it pertained to the story after the Civil War, the movement of exodusters towards Kansas represented a larger question, which was, what then shall we do, right? If it is true that a lot of our, and it was, that a lot of our most noble leaders from the Union were contemplating what shall we do with these Black people after the Civil War, Kansas and the West more broadly was was deeply enmeshed in answering that question for themselves, right? They were asking and answering. And so, and what we see in the book is we see people like Governor St. John who presents as if he's really interested in integrating and using his resources, though finite, to supporting Black people, when in actuality, he was very interested in their votes. He was very much uninterested in using state resources to aid in the support of Black people who had made their way into Kansas, such that then they were really relegated to the question of charity. And so, to some extent, like, well, that feels quite reminiscent, of what was going on more broadly. Then when we examine Oklahoma, Oklahoma to me, especially as someone who grew up there, has continuously, even now and definitely back then, been almost this slightly laboratorical experiment, right? What do we do with the indigenous peoples in the Southeast? Well, let's dispatch them to this place. What are we going to do with a lot of Black people and these, what are we going to do with some of our poor white immigrants? What are we going to do when we look at the history of the Wobblies, specifically in southeastern Oklahoma, the labor movement? Like, what are we going to do with all of these groups, right? Well, let's place them in this finite space that we've already then cleared out ostensibly to make room for other groups that want to try their hand at becoming more American. And so to some extent, Oklahoma to me almost serves, and the broader West, but Oklahoma in particular serves as a bit of an elegy, right? It is a very sad song to reflect on what Oklahoma has been. So to some extent, when I see you asked about Tulsa specifically, or even I'm assuming primarily even the northern Tulsa area, right? The Greenwood area and deep Greenwood area, to me, I just reflect on it with just distinct sadness, right? In part because um, despite how successful, both in myth and reality, the Greenwood community was, it was fashioned and constructed um, not as not it was not allowed to thrive. It thrived as a result of people experimenting, right? The even invention of some of these places, not just North Tulsa, but Tallahassee and Ofuskee and Langston and Boley, it was people's, in many cases, last-ditch efforts on trying to construct their own place whereby they could live and exist freely. And to me, that felt so distinctly American, in part because the mere fact that they were there was a construction of America's willingness to allow, or not even to allow, but America's willingness to um, relegate those without to trying to construct with scraps a life of meaning and existence. And it just, to me, is always read as the most American of tragedies, but a tragedy nonetheless.
Well, I think in your book, you do a fantastic job of capturing both this tragic, but also, right, the kind of real promise and optimism, right, that kind of
Mhm.
marks this era. And again, I want to encourage Muster's readers and the JCW readers to kind of pick up and read Black Moses, a saga of ambition and the fight for a Black state. Caleb Gayle, thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate your time and look forward